So we are joined by Matthew Bishop, New York Bureau Chief and the American Business Editor for The Economist. Welcome to INSEAD, Mr. Bishop.
Great to be here.
And we'll talk about philanthrocapitalism and your perspective on it as reflected in the book and as it has evolved since then. Maybe you could start by looking at really what is the genesis of philanthrocapitalism, because one could say that the state exists because the market fails to do certain things, and the market exists because the state fails to do certain things. Why does philanthrocapitalism exist? Is it because the state and the market both fail in certain contexts?
So philanthrocapitalism is about how the capitalist system is increasingly, and the most successful people in it are increasingly engaged in addressing explicitly the philanthropy, the benefit of humankind. And I think this is something that has been a historical pattern. As we in philanthrocapitalism, we write about how there have been several golden ages of philanthropy where there's been, each of them has come after a period of tremendous entrepreneurial wealth creation, and then the entrepreneurs actually try and come up with entrepreneurial solutions to society's problems. And so we're seeing that historical pattern repeat itself again today. But as you say, what's different this time round is that whereas in previous golden ages of philanthropy, the state was a relatively minor player, today we have massive presence of government, and yet some of the biggest problems facing the world we've made very little progress in solving, whether it be massive poverty and disease in the developing world, or the state education system in some difficult urban environments in rich countries, or climate change, all those sorts of issues. And there's a growing realization that government, at least as we've done it in democracies over the last 50 years, has got limitations. And I think the philanthrocapitalism that we see today, one of its themes is about finding private sector alternatives to solve society's problems to a government approach. And part of it is about actually trying to figure out how to make government function better by bringing the energy and the entrepreneurship of the private sector to bear on government.
So when you say to bring the energy, the ideas, the ambition, the tools of the private sector, so is philanthrocapitalism, let's say, does it refer primarily to the actions of individuals such as Bill Gates and Warren Buffett? Or would you include in philanthrocapitalism actions of companies such as Walmart or others? Well,
in the book we look at the behavior of a number of well-known individuals and also a few companies. So it is the Bill Gateses, the George Soros, Warren Buffett, the Google guys, Richard Branson, Ted Turner. But then also we look at companies like Walmart, General Electric, Nike, and so forth. And I think those are all lenses to look at a much broader phenomena that's going on, which is, I think up until about 10 or 15 years ago, we were thinking in terms of business is all about creating wealth, and government and charity is all about solving society's problems. And I think the barriers between those two different worlds are coming down, and what we're getting is a lot of experimentation, of partnering, of business getting into heart issues, of caring organizations becoming more business-like, of government wanting to partner with both business and charity in new ways. And so those individuals and companies are just sort of well-known examples to explore a much broader movement of change and trying to be more innovative and entrepreneurial in solving society's problems than the old bifurcated world that was the familiar one until recently.
But if you take, let's say, the case of companies, I spent 30 years studying companies, and for companies I can see a dilemma in the sense that, of course, if the company is going after economic return for its shareholders, that's a very straightforward story. But if the company does something which may not have an economic return, but would have a social return. Now, Bill Gates, of course, when he sets up the foundation, he may not be interested in economic return. He probably is not. What he is interested in is maximizing social return. But a company like Walmart is still very much, in fact, a private sector company which needs to give economic return. Now, if you create social return, that's, let's say, like a public good. It's not a private good. And so for companies, there is this dilemma about, do you create public goods? And in fact, a public good for which your shareholders, if you will, are paying, but you're not the only beneficiary of it. And should you do it, should you not do it?
You know, I think one of the challenges of this new era that we're in, the philanthrocapitalism era, where you know, the barriers between the business world and government and non-profit world are all coming down, is to figure out how do we stop that just becoming a kind of a fudge, a mudge. How do we actually make it a more effective problem-solving system than we had before? And I think that means understanding what the respective roles that business, philanthropy, social entrepreneurship, government can best play, and getting them to focus on what they do best and avoid what they do worst. And I think you're right. I mean, businesses, particularly for-profit public companies, they are going to be constrained in what they can do by their need to satisfy their shareholders. Now, you know, a philanthropist doesn't have that constraint, although it's interesting that some philanthropies now are trying to do both grants, traditional giving, and also for-profit investments where they think that they can take on really high-risk for-profit opportunities where, if they succeed, they will do good by leveraging the capital markets in a way that hadn't been done so explicitly in the past. But businesses, if you're a company, you know, I think you know, you have got to think about your shareholders. Now, what's interesting to me is that 20 years ago, the Milton Friedman view of the world, you know, I think was pretty dominant in boardrooms, and we saw a number of companies, you know, very much focus on short-term profit maximization and get into trouble with the public, and their reputation suffered. So companies like Nike and BP and Shell and Nestle all got, in different ways, really badly beaten up in the public domain. And I think that was the start of a process which got management to start saying, well, maybe we need to think slightly more sophisticatedly about the world we operate in, and to understand the social context of business. Now, I think initially a lot of what happened was more about public relations and damage limitation. I think you're now seeing a very interesting agenda which companies like Walmart, I think, most obviously embody, which is, if you think long term, you know, actually there are some big issues that if you engage with them creatively, you can actually come up with profitable strategies. So Walmart is saying the world is moving towards a carbon-constrained, carbon-priced system, and therefore the more we can produce products that are low carbon, that are good for the environment, the more, you know, we're going to be on the right side of history, and that's going to be a very, very profitable strategy in the long run, and it's already being profitable for them.
That's right, exactly.
And, you know, I think that there's been also the fact that more and more multinational companies realise that they're going to be seeing most of their future profit growth as customers, as their customers are in the developing world, that they are switching from a mentality which is the developing world is where we get cheap labour, to one where this is a world where our future customers are going to be. And I think you're much less likely to want to be known for exploiting people in the labour force when you think that in 10 years' time they may be our most important customers. And so there's a much more constructive view in that world. And there's also a realisation that as people get richer, if you're a consumer goods company, people have much more discretion about what they put on their feet or what they eat, and they want to know who's made it, what conditions has it been made under, is it being made in a way that's sustainable, and the information that's going to be available for them to know about those products and to be able to answer those questions thanks to the internet is going to be much greater. So companies are having to think more in more enlightened ways on that front as well, and reputations are much more important now than they were 10 or 20 years ago. Also in terms of recruiting people, if you're in a war for talent, you've got to use everything in your in your toolbox to persuade people to work for you. And if people regard you as a company that is on the wrong side of history, that doesn't get where society is going, that doesn't have a vision of the world that you want to be part of as a person, then you'll go to another company. And so I think a lot of companies are also engaging in a more constructive way in solving society's problems for that reason as well.
So that's actually interesting, because one could interpret what you're saying is that companies have always tried to be smart capitalists, but what it means to be a smart capitalist today is probably different from what it might have meant 30 years ago. And the reason is because consumers, employees, they're a lot more socially conscious, and you have the internet effect, so that the company's actions in one domain are very visible in another domain. And so for a Walmart to be a smart capitalist today, they have to be a lot more comprehensive in what they include in the creation of their own strategies and their actions. Would that be a fair interpretation?
Yeah, I don't know whether I would say that companies have always been smart capitalists in the past. I think what is clear, though, is that now, and even more so in the future, being a smart capitalist, maximising your company's shareholder value over the long run, means you've got to understand society, and you've got to be on the right side of progress, and you've got to be seen as having helped contribute rather than being part of the problem. And I think that is something that companies should be doing for capitalistic reasons. If Milton Friedman were alive today, I would hope that he would understand that this is something that being successful in business requires you to do, not something that is a diversion from your core mission. Now, clearly, I think a lot of Milton Friedman's original thinking was to try and stop governments imposing lots of social responsibilities on companies, and I think all that I'm saying doesn't address that question. I think he may still have a point that actually we don't want necessarily governments loading business up with loads of responsibilities, but we do want business actually thinking in an enlightened, self-interested way about the world it operates in.
That's right. And also, actually, that one might interpret that given what smart capitalism means today and what it will mean tomorrow, for the reasons that you just talked about, is that this makes the conditions particularly ripe, if you will, for a complementary role between the Bill Gates and George Soros as individuals, and companies, to let's say play a partnership role, almost in the same way that, say, venture capital comes in as private equity, but then of course they hope for the companies to go public, and so there is the public equity market, and they play different roles at different stages in the evolution.
And it's an interesting question to ask. Bill Gates has now talked publicly about creative capitalism, about how we need to change how we reward firms in capitalism, that we need to find some system to actually say, yes, this company is playing a better role in society than that competitor, and to somehow make it worth it for those companies to do that. And you wonder whether, had he been starting Microsoft today, would he have had a very different view of his social mission than he had when he started the firm. And you take a company like Google, which was created when it went public with a specific business unit focused on philanthropy, and very much sees using its core competences and its core strategy as a way of doing good in the world. Its corporate motto is do no evil.
Also, if you look at the evolution of philanthrocapitalism, at least let's say in the recent decades, that would you say that it has gone through evolutionary phases, almost like one could say philanthrocapitalism 1.0, 2.0, some kind of significant shifts in how the idea of philanthrocapitalism is operationalized?
No, I think so. If you look at, if we say that the dawn of the modern era of big donors was Ted Turner's $1 billion pledge to the United Nations. Yeah, I think it was 1998.
Yeah, okay.
And he basically made this pledge with no idea as to how it would be implemented. I think he had a view that he'd write a check to the UN for $1 billion and they'd pay off. That would represent.
Did he actually give the money?
In the end, they figured out they needed to create a whole set of structures that would, because it turned out it wasn't legal for the UN to accept money from private individuals, so they created an Office of Partnerships. He created a foundation that was focused around the UN, and a whole set of institutional models have emerged that now every multilateral organisation, the World Bank or whatever, they have their own partnership offices. They look to build different relationships with philanthropists, have a seat at the table. You see something like the Global Fund for AIDS, tuberculosis and malaria that actually gives a formal seat for philanthropists alongside government representatives on the board. So in that level, institutionally things have emerged. I think also you're now seeing what corporations think about as corporate philanthropy is turning into more corporate citizenship and more core strategies around social change. You're seeing philanthropists like Pierre Omidyar simultaneously in the same foundation structure, both giving money away and investing in for-profit missions, and they decide which way to fund an organisation relatively late in the day. What they're more interested in is trying to figure out what mission they're trying to achieve, and then they figure out what's the most effective way of financing that particular project, whether it be for-profit or non-profit. So there's a lot of kind of interesting iterations and evolution going on in philanthrocapitalism, for sure.
Picking up on the kinds of things that I spend a lot of time studying these days, which is what's happening in China and India and how that's affecting. In your talk today morning, you talked about that Bill Gates anticipates that India may become in the next 5 years the second in terms of size in the philanthrocapitalism domain, and that China may be very close. What's driving the emergence of philanthrocapitalism in India and China? And particularly I'm very curious about China, because Confucianism is a very different philosophy, if you will, from Hinduism. And also in China, the government at least operates under the premise that the government is effective and the government should be able to take care of the externalities that, if you will, the private sector cannot on its own. Any perspective on that and the spread of philanthrocapitalism in India and China?
I think philanthrocapitalism is definitely a global force, and I think partly it's going hand in hand with the fact that there seem to be global trends that are producing these billionaires around the world that many of which are in emerging markets. And I think what organisations like the World Economic Forum do, and even the Forbes list, is where you're comparing a developing country billionaire with Bill Gates. They're on the same list. Increasingly, peer pressure is being applied in a way that, and Gates will go around the world and he'll gather, when he's in India, he'll gather the leading Indian billionaires together and say, let's have a conversation about philanthropy, and because it's Bill Gates, they'll come and sit down. And I think that is creating a lot of peer pressure. I think there is also a fascination in the developing world that, although it's been damaged a bit by the recent problems in the American capitalist system, but the world looks to America as the model of how to do things right. And philanthropy has always been a big part of American capitalism. And so there is a looking in places like India to the American example, and they're seeing the high-profile philanthropists and they're saying, well, we should do the same. I think also, particularly in India, there is an awareness that there are massive social problems, particularly failure to educate and feed a lot of poor people, and massive problems of failure in government and so forth, that I think the wealth creators are now realising that they need to do something about. They can't rely on government to fix it because government is so bureaucratic, and that they need to take the initiative, otherwise they're going to have real threats to the Indian growth story. And so that's why they're starting to do some very interesting stuff, and Gates thinks that India will become the second most philanthropic country relatively shortly. China is more interesting because I think, as you say, there is a lot of suspicion by the government of any civil society activity.
NGOs.
NGOs and so forth. On the other hand, I think there is a realisation that this notion of a harmonious society, that you have got these new wealthy that are potentially behaving in ways that don't fit that harmonious society vision, and that maybe encouraging them to give back is a good thing. I think after the earthquake a couple of years ago, that was the first time there was a real encouragement by the government for that kind of basic humanitarian giving. Whether they're going to want the sort of structural social change sort of giving that the philanthrocapitalists are associated with, I think that may be a little further off. But you do see people like Jet Li promoting the notion of giving through the cell phone and the internet and so forth, which is for the first time, and is being actively encouraged by the government in China. It's starting to build the roots of a philanthropic culture, and so it'll be interesting to see how that evolves. And partly, I think it'll be a question of, does the Chinese government start to feel overwhelmed by some of these social problems that it faces, and does it see part of the transition to a more democratic structure that may be giving some of the new wealthy leading roles in solving some of these problems, it becomes an attractive solution, or whether they actually go in a more egalitarian line and crack down on the rich.
And also, it'd probably be very interesting to see that in China, that I think the concept of charity, as like after the Beichuan earthquake, that I think one could imagine that happening very easily, and that's happening already. But then, do the entrepreneurs who take on social causes, or let's say who donate money, do they get involved into policy initiatives? So that would be an interesting question to see, because one could imagine NGOs or private entrepreneurs taking lead on policy initiatives in India and more or less competing with the government, if you will, and the government saying, okay, that's fine. But in China, it would be interesting to see how that gets played out and how philanthrocapitalism evolves.
I think it really will. It does go to the heart of what kind of society China is going to be over the next 20 years, which I think is one of the huge questions facing the world. Is China going to be able to move to a more inclusive, democratic-like society, or is it going to go down some other route, a more authoritarian route, and what does that say about the sustainability of its own growth story? And so, I personally think if they can find a way to bring philanthrocapitalism in, that it will help them build a more sustainable capitalism than they have at the moment. But it remains to be seen if they will share my view of the world.
Last question. What about any perspective on philanthrocapitalism in Russia?
Well, I think
that's another big, economy with a lot of billionaires.
So at the end of the philanthrocapitalism, we tried in our last chapter to say, how should the rest of us judge billionaires? What's the good billionaire guide? And we set out 4 criteria for judging them. And the first is that they should make their money in a non-exploitative way. The second is that they should pay a decent amount of taxes. The third is that they should give more of their income and wealth away than people on lesser income and wealth. And fourthly, that they should do their philanthropy thoughtfully, with a view to maximising the social returns on the money. So, I think Bill Gates does very well on all 4 criteria. When you look at your typical Russian oligarch, in many cases you would say they got their money through exploitative means, kleptocracy or whatever. Now, sometimes that can be a powerful motivation for redemption and for redemption-based philanthropy, and so maybe some of them are giving back for that reason. I think typically where philanthropy is happening in Russia, it's more that Putin and the Kremlin are saying to them, give us some of your money, buy those Fabergé eggs or whatever, send back this religious artifact to Russia, give money towards some hospitals and things, more as a way of just saying, well, you're just a little bit too wealthy, we want some of that. But
like the old days of the emperors.
Yeah, and I think Latin America is also, it's an interesting question as to whether some of the leading Latin American wealthy will really do constructive philanthrocapitalism, or whether they will be more about giving whatever minimum amount they have to do to protect their monopolistic positions and so forth, which I think is more characteristic of the Russian situation.
Thank you very much for coming to INSEAD.
Thank you. Pleasure talking with you.
Thank you, Matthew.